Welcome to the Destiny Awaits podcast. I am your host, Andrea John, and today we have a very special episode. If you've been following along, we've been diving deep into the Sermon on the Mount called the Jesus Speaks series. But today, we're taking a break from that series to talk about something deeply personal and incredibly important: domestic abuse. It's a reality that affects so many, including myself, because I'm a survivor. I know what it's like to feel trapped, to wonder if things will ever change, and to question whether freedom is even possible. But I also know the power of breaking free, reclaiming your life, and stepping into healing. Like Sarah, the woman whose story I'll be sharing today, I found the courage to leave because of my daughters. Their well-being became my turning point, and while I'm still on my journey of healing, I share Sarah's story as a way of giving voice to those who still feel trapped, are searching for hope, and for those who have already taken their first steps towards freedom. This episode is more than just a story. It's a call to awareness, a voice for those who feel unheard, and an invitation to join the conversation. Domestic abuse is a silent epidemic, and it's time we bring it into the light. That's why I'm currently working on a project in Florida to strengthen domestic abuse laws and create resources for law enforcement and survivors. If you are a survivor, advocate, legal expert, or therapist and would like to be a part of this effort, I would love to hear from you. Together, we can push for real change and provide the support that so many desperately need. Before we begin, I want to give a trigger warning. This episode contains themes of domestic abuse, including emotional and physical abuse. If you find these topics distressing, please listen with care. And if you or someone you know is in an abusive situation, please seek help. There are many people ready to support you. In the show notes, I will provide resources available to everyone. Now, let's begin Sarah's story. My prayer is that it speaks to your heart the way it has spoken to mine. Chapter 1. Shadows in the Light. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains, casting a gentle glow across the room. The soft hum of a distant car engine was the only sound breaking the silence of the early hour. Sarah stirred in her bed, eyes still shut, trying to cling to the last remnants of a fleeting dream. A dream where she felt safe, loved, and free. But the moment her mind began to awaken, her reality crept in like an unwelcome visitor, and the familiar weight settled on her chest. Sarah knew that she had to get up, but the thought of facing another day drained her of the little energy she had left. She rolled over, hoping to find solace in the warmth of her husband's body, but the cold, empty space beside her was a stark reminder that she was alone, even when he was home. Mark, her husband of 10 years, had already left for work, or at least that's what he told her the night before. His late nights and early departures had become routine, as had the excuses: meetings, overtime, last-minute calls. Sarah wasn't naive. She knew what was going on. The scent of unfamiliar perfume clung to his clothes, the occasional lipstick smudge on his collar, the coldness in his eyes whenever he looked at her. It all painted a picture she couldn't bear to acknowledge. Still, she stayed. She stayed for the sake of her daughters, Lily and Emily, who were the only light in her dark world. They were too young, too innocent to understand the turmoil that brewed beneath the surface of their family. Lily, at 10 years old, was already showing signs of maturity beyond her years, often taking on the role of the little mother, caring for her younger sister when Sarah couldn't muster the strength. Emily, only 7, was a bundle of joy and curiosity, always asking questions and always seeking love and attention. Sarah finally pushed herself out of bed, her movements slow and deliberate. She headed to the bathroom, splashed cold water on her face, and stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman who stared back at her was a stranger. Dark circles under her eyes, hair that had lost its shine, a mouth that rarely remembered to smile. She traced the lines on her face with her fingers, wondering when she had begun to age so rapidly. When had she lost herself? She sighed and turned away from the mirror. There was no time to dwell on what was lost. She had to get the girls ready for school. The hallway outside her bedroom was lined with framed photographs, pictures of a life that seemed so distant now. There was their wedding photo where Sarah smiled with the naivety of a woman who believed in fairy tales. There were pictures of Lily and Emily as babies, their angelic faces, their angelic faces beaming with joy. As she passed each frame, Sarah couldn't help but feel the sting of loss. The life she had once dreamed of had slipped through her fingers, replaced by something far darker. She reached the girl's room and gently pushed the door open. The sight that greeted her was a rare moment of peace. Lily and Emily were still asleep, their chests rising and falling, their faces serene. Sarah stood in the doorway watching them, a lump forming in her throat. They were her everything, her reason for getting up every morning, her motivation to keep going when all she wanted to do was give up. "Mommy?" Lily's voice broke the silence. She had always been a light sleeper, attuned to the slightest change in her environment. She opened her eyes and smiled when she saw her mother. "Good morning, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, forcing a smile as she crossed her room and sat on the edge of Lily's bed. She brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face, her heart swelling with love and sorrow. Emily stirred next, her eyes fluttering open, still heavy with sleep. She yawned and stretched, then reached to her mother. "Mommy, I had a dream about a rainbow." "Did you, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, pulling Emily into her arms. "What was it like?" "It was big and bright, with all the colors, and there was a pot of gold at the end," Emily said, her voice filled with childlike wonder. "And we were all there, me, Lily, you, and Daddy. We were so happy." Sarah's heart constricted at the mention of Mark. She forced another smile and kissed the top of Emily's head. "That sounds like a beautiful dream, honey." But Sarah knew better than to believe in dreams. Her reality was far less colorful, and the pot of gold at the end of their family's rainbow was an illusion, one she had chased for far too long. "Come on, girls, it's time to get ready for school," Sarah said, standing up and gently pulling Emily out of bed. Lily and Emily began their morning routine with the energy of children who hadn't yet been burdened by life's harsh realities. She envied their innocence, their ability to find joy in the simplest of things. As they dressed and brushed their teeth, she prepared breakfast. Cereal and fruit, the best she could manage with the limited supplies in the kitchen. The girls chatted excitedly about their plans for the day, oblivious to the tension that lingered in the air. Sarah listened, nodding and smiling at the right moments, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the bills that needed to be paid, groceries that were running low, and the lies Mark would tell when he returned home. As the girls finished their breakfast, Sarah checked the time. "Hurry up, or you'll be late," she said, urging them to gather their things. "Are you okay, Mommy?" Lily asked, her perceptive eyes scanning her mother's face. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "I'm fine, sweetie, just a little tired." Lily didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. She simply hugged her mother and said, "I love you." "I love you too," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. After the girls had left for school, the house felt silent again. Sarah stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty bowls on the table. The quiet was deafening, and for a moment, she felt the weight of her reality crashing down on her. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white, as she fought back the tears that threatened to spill over. How had her life come to this? How had she become a shell of the woman she once was? Sarah thought back to the early days of their relationship when Mark had swept her off her feet with his wit and charisma, promising her the world. But those promises had been empty, and the love he once professed had turned into something dark and twisted. The first time he put his hands on her, it had been over something trivial, an argument about money. Sarah had been shocked, unable to understand how the man she loved could grab her by the neck and throw her up against the wall. The breath had been knocked out of her, and her heart raced with fear. He had apologized immediately afterwards, begging her for forgiveness and promising it would never happen again. And she had believed him, wanting so desperately to hold on to the man that she thought that he was. But the abuse didn't stop. It escalated, each incident leaving her more broken than the last. He isolated her from family, manipulated her into believing she was worthless, and punished her whenever she tried to assert herself. And then there were the affairs. Countless women, each one a reminder of how little he valued her. Despite it all, Sarah stayed. She told herself she was doing it for the girls. They needed their father. She could endure anything as long as they were safe. But deep down, she knew it was fear keeping her there. Fear of the unknown, of being alone, fear of admitting she had made a terrible mistake. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Her heart skipped a beat and her body tensed for a moment, but when she turned, relief washed over her. It was only Mrs. Jenkins, a woman who had been like a mother to her for years. They had met at church and had become a trusted friend for Sarah, offering guidance, wisdom, and kindness when she needed it the most. "Good morning, Sarah," Mrs. Jenkins said with her usual warmth, stepping into the kitchen. "I thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing today." Sarah forced a smile, trying to mask the turmoil she felt inside. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins, but I'm fine." Mrs. Jenkins walked closer, her sharp eyes full of concern, and studied Sarah for a moment. "You know, Sarah, you don't have to carry all of this on your own. I'm here if you ever need a talk or need any help with the girls." Sarah's smile wavered, her heart heavy with the unspoken truths she kept locked away. Mrs. Jenkins had always been there for her, offering support and love like a mother would. But Sarah wasn't ready to share the reality of her situation. Not yet. "Thank you," Sarah replied quietly. "I appreciate it." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, sensing Sarah's reluctance to open up. She reached out and placed a gentle hand on Sarah's arm. "Just remember, sweetheart, you're stronger than you think. And those girls, they're blessed to have you as their mother." As Mrs. Jenkins left, her words echoed in Sarah's mind. "You're stronger than you think." She wished she could believe that. But all she felt was weak and trapped, caught in the web of a life that seemed impossible to escape. The day passed in a blur of chores and distractions, anything to keep her mind from dwelling on the emptiness inside of her. By the time the girls had returned from school, Sarah had managed to push the darkest thoughts to the back of her mind and put on her brave face for them. The three of them spent the evening together, huddled up on a couch watching a movie together. It was one of those rare moments of peace where, for a little while, Sarah could forget about everything and just enjoy being with her daughters. But even then, the shadow of Mark's presence loomed over them, a constant reminder that their peace was fragile. When bedtime came, Sarah tucked Lily and Emily in, kissing them goodnight and whispering words of love and comfort. She lingered in their room for a moment, watching them as they drifted off to sleep, their breathing steady and calm. She envied their ability to find rest so easily. As she closed their door and retreated to her own room, the weight of the day settled back on her shoulders. She climbed into bed, the silence of the house pressing in on her, and stared up at the ceiling. She knew Mark would be home late, if at all, and even if he came home, it would only bring more tension, more pain. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to will herself to sleep, but the thoughts kept whirling in her mind. How long could she keep living like this? How much more could she endure before she completely lost herself? She thought of her daughters and the life she wanted for them, a life free from fear and pain, a life filled with love and security. But that life seemed so far out of reach, a distant dream she couldn't quite grasp. And yet deep down, a small voice whispered to her, "You're stronger than you think." Sarah wasn't sure if she believed it yet. But as she lay there in the darkness, she held onto a glimmer of hope. It was all that she had. And perhaps, just perhaps, it would be enough. Chapter 2. The Descent into Darkness. The sound of the front door slamming shut echoed through the house like a thunderclap, causing Sarah to flinch. She stood frozen in the kitchen, a half-prepared dinner laid out on the counter in front of her. The air was thick with tension, an invisible weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She could hear Mark's heavy footsteps in the hallway, each step a reminder of the storm about to hit. Mark entered the kitchen, his face a mask of anger. His eyes, once warm and filled with affection, were now cold and hard, devoid of any emotion except contempt. He didn't say a word as he brushed past Sarah, knocking a glass off the counter with a careless swipe of his arm. It shattered on the floor, making a sharp and jarring sound. Sarah's heart raced as she knelt to pick up the pieces, her hands trembling. She didn't dare look up at him or say anything that might set him off. She had learned over the years that silence was her best defense. The fewer words she spoke, the less ammunition he had to use against her. But her silence wasn't enough. "Are you deaf, Sarah?" Mark's voice cut through the tension like a knife, harsh and accusatory. "I asked you a question." Sarah blinked while trying to focus on the shards of glass in her hand, but her mind was blank. She hadn't heard him say anything, hadn't even realized he was talking to her. She was too consumed by the fear that had become a constant companion and had wrapped itself around her like a suffocating shroud. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't hear you." Mark's response was swift and brutal. He grabbed her by the arm, yanking her to her feet with a force that made her gasp in pain. The glass fell from her hand, falling to the floor once more. "I said, where the hell is dinner?" He snarled, his grip tightening on her arm. Sarah winced, the pain shooting through her arm like a bolt of electricity. "I was just about to finish it," she stammered, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I'm sorry, I'll hurry." Mark released her with a shove, sending her stumbling backwards. "You're useless," he muttered as he turned away and headed to the living room. "Can't even get a simple dinner ready on time." Sarah bit her lip to keep from crying out as she rubbed her bruised arm. She waited until Mark had disappeared into the other room before allowing herself to breathe again. The glass crunched beneath her feet as she moved to clean up the mess, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite control. This is how it had been for the past few years. What had once been occasional outbursts were now the norm. Mark's temper was a constant presence, like a dark cloud hanging over their home, ready to unleash its fury at the slightest provocation. At first, the abuse had been subtle: cutting remarks, passive-aggressive comments, and the occasional silent treatment. But over time, it had escalated, each incident worse than the last. Sarah tried to make excuses for him in the beginning. She had convinced herself he was just stressed from work, and he didn't really mean the things he said. But as the abuse became more frequent and intense, those excuses began to wear thin. And with each passing day, Sarah felt herself slipping further and further into a void she couldn't escape. The first time he put his hands on her, it was like the world stopped. They had been arguing, nothing new, but you could see the anger in his eyes. Before Sarah could react, he grabbed her by the neck, his fingers tightening around her throat. Panic surged through her as her back hit the wall with a hard thud, knocking the breathing out of her. Her heart raced, fear rising like a tidal wave as she clawed at his hands, desperate for air. The rage in his eyes terrified her to her core. He let go suddenly and she crumpled to the floor, grasping for breath, her body trembling. The pain from the impact coursed through her, but it was the fear, the sudden realization things had shifted in a way she couldn't ignore, paralyzing her. At that moment, she knew things would never be the same. Mark had apologized afterwards, of course. He swore it would never happen again, begged for her forgiveness, and even cried. And Sarah, desperate to believe him, had forgiven him. She had told herself it was a one-time thing. He would never hurt her again like that. But he had hurt her again, and each time the apologies became more insincere, filled with excuses, while his promises to change became nothing more than empty words. The abuse became a regular occurrence, and with each incident, a piece of Sarah's spirit was stripped away. She started to withdraw, to retreat into herself, the vibrant woman she once was, fading into a mere shadow. The verbal and psychological abuse was just as damaging, if not more so. Mark was a master at manipulation, knowing exactly how to tear Sarah down with his words. He would belittle her, call her names, and make her feel like she was worthless. He would blame her for everything that went wrong in their lives, convincing her she was the root of all their problems. Over time, Sarah began to believe him. She began to internalize his words, to see herself through his eyes as a failure, burden, and a woman who couldn't do anything right. Even the smallest tasks became sources of anxiety for her. Cooking dinner, doing laundry, taking care of the girls, everything was an opportunity for Mark to find fault. And when he did, he would unleash his wrath without mercy. The once mundane aspects of daily life became minefields, and Sarah found herself walking on eggshells, constantly trying to avoid triggering his anger. But no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. There was always something wrong, something to set him off. And with each new outburst, Sarah's sense of self-worth eroded further. She no longer recognized the woman she had become, a woman who flinched at every loud noise, lived in constant fear of her own husband, slept with a knife under her pillow fearing for her life, and feeling like a prisoner in her own home. The effects of the abuse were starting to seep into other aspects of her life as well. Sarah used to be an active member of the community, involved in her daughter's school activities, volunteering at church, and maintaining friendships with other mothers. But slowly, she began to withdraw from those social circles. Mark's constant criticism made her feel ashamed, and she didn't want others to see how far she had fallen. She stopped going to church, stopped attending school functions, and stopped answering phone calls from friends. It was easier to isolate herself than to face the reality of her situation. Her daughters, Lily and Emily, were the only things keeping her together, but even they were starting to notice the change in their mother. Lily, always perceptive beyond her years, would often ask if Sarah was okay, her young eyes filled with concern. And though Sarah would always assure her she was fine, she could see the doubt in her daughter's eyes. Emily was too young to understand what was really happening, as she had never built a strong relationship with Mark because he was barely home. She was the kind of child who kept things light, always finding humor in everything. Yet, despite her playful nature, Emily was very clingy to Sarah and constantly worried about her. She seemed to know enough to worry that her mother would be taken away from her. Often, in the middle of the night, Emily would climb into her mother's bed, seeking comfort, and Sarah would hold her close, whispering words of reassurance she didn't truly believe herself. It broke Sarah's heart to see the effect the abuse was having on her daughters. They were growing up in an unstable environment filled with fear and hostility, and no matter how hard she tried to shield them from it, she knew they weren't oblivious. She could see it in the way Lily hesitated before speaking, as if she was afraid of saying something wrong. She could see it in the way Emily flinched at loud noises, her small body trembling with fear. Sarah knew this wasn't the life she wanted for her daughters. They deserved so much more than this. More than an inconsistent father who prioritized things above them, more than a mother who was too broken to protect them. But the thought of leaving, of uprooting their lives, paralyzed her with fear. How could she survive on her own? How could she take care of her daughters on her own? Where would they go? These questions haunted Sarah, keeping her trapped in a cycle of indecision and despair. She felt like she was drowning, each day pulling her further and further under the surface, and with every breath she took, it became harder to see a way out. The nights were the worst. It was during the dark, silent hours the full weight of her situation would fall upon her, crushing her beneath its enormity. She would lie awake in bed, listening to the sound of Mark snoring while her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't escape. She would replay the day's events over and over in her head, analyzing every word, every action, trying to figure out where she had gone wrong and how she could have avoided his anger. But there were no answers, only an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. The woman she had once been, the woman who had dreams, ambitions, and love for life, was gone, replaced by someone she didn't recognize, someone who was hopeless, beaten down, and lost. Sarah tried to find solace in small things, moment of peace with her daughters, a good book, a run, but even these moments were tainted by the knowledge that they were temporary. The storm was always just around the corner waiting to strike. As the abuse continued, Sarah found herself retreating further into her mind, creating a mental fortress where she could hide from the reality of her life. She would go through the motions of her day, working, cooking, cleaning, and caring for the girls, without really being present, her mind numb to the world around her. It was a survival mechanism, a way to protect herself from the pain that threatened to consume her. But as she withdrew, she could see the toll it was taking on her daughters. Lily, in particular, had always been full of energy, endless curiosity, and constantly singing. But lately, Sarah could see something was changing in her daughter. It wasn't just the sadness in her eyes. Her confidence was slowly slipping away. Once afraid to speak her mind, Lily now seemed hesitant, afraid to say the wrong thing for fear of being punished. The lively, outspoken girl Sarah once knew was retreating into herself, and it broke her heart to see her daughter so unsure of her own voice. Emily, too, was changing. She had always been a sensitive child, but the constant tension in the house was starting to wear on her. She would cling to Sarah more than ever, seeking comfort and reassurance her mother could no longer provide. And when Mark's anger would erupt, she covered her ears, her eyes wide with fear, her small body trembling as she tried to block out the noise. The impact of the abuse on her daughters filled her with a deep, knowing guilt. She had promised herself she would protect them. She would never let them experience the pain she had endured. One night, after another particularly brutal argument with Mark, Sarah sat alone in the living room, the house eerily quiet. The girls were asleep, and Mark had stormed out, slamming the door behind him. She didn't know where he had gone, and for the first time, she didn't care. All she could think about was how tired she was. Tired of fighting, tired of fear, tired of the life she was living. She stared at the family photos on the wall, the smiling faces frozen in time, a stark contrast to the reality of their lives. She used to look at those photos with a sense of pride, a reminder of the life she had built, the family she loved. But now all she felt was a deep, overwhelming sadness. The woman in those photos was gone, replaced by someone she no longer recognized. She turned to see Lily standing in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted by the dim light from the hallway. "Mommy, are you okay?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, sweetheart. You can go back to bed." Lily hesitated, then crossed a room and climbed onto the couch beside her mother. She curled up next to Sarah, resting her head on her shoulder. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah's heart broke at the sound of her daughter's fear. She wrapped her arms around Lily and held her close. "It's okay, sweetheart. Everything's going to be okay." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were a lie. Nothing was okay, and deep down she knew it never would be as long as they stayed in this house, in this life. Lily looked up at her mother, her eyes filled with a sadness no child should ever feel. "Why is Daddy always so mad?" The question hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She had no answer. No way to explain the complexities of their situation to her innocent child. How could she make Lily understand something she didn't fully understand herself? "I don't know, sweetheart," Sarah finally whispered, her voice breaking. "I just don't know." Lily nodded, her small hand reaching up to wipe away the tears beginning to fall from Sarah's eyes. "I love you, Mommy," she said softly. "I love you too," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. They sat there in silence for a while, the weight of their world pressing down on them. Eventually, Lily fell asleep on her mother's arms, her breathing slow and steady. But Sarah remained awake, her mind racing with thoughts that she couldn't silence. She couldn't keep living like this or putting her daughters through this nightmare. But the thought of leaving, of starting over, terrified her. Could she raise the girls on her own? Where would they go? What would people think? These questions haunted her, keeping her trapped in a cycle of indecision and despair. But as she held her daughter close, Sarah felt a small spark of determination ignite within her. She would not keep living in fear or keep letting Mark control their lives. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to consider the possibility of leaving. It was a terrifying thought, but as she looked down at her sleeping daughter, she knew it was the only option. She refused to keep putting her daughters or herself through this. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be safe, but it was the only way out. As Sarah sat in darkness, holding her daughter close, she made a silent promise to herself. She would find a way out to protect her daughters and to give them the life they deserved. And maybe, just maybe, she would find a way to reclaim the woman she used to be, the woman who was strong, unafraid, and whole. Thank you so much for listening to this special episode of the Destiny Awaits podcast. Sarah's story is one of courage, survival, and hope, but it is also a work of fiction. While her journey may not be tied to one real person, the emotions, struggles, and triumphs that she experiences are all too real for so many. If this story so far has resonated with you and you'd like to know how it ends, you can find Breaking Free on Amazon. The link is in the show notes, along with resources for victims and survivors of domestic abuse. If you or someone you know is in an abusive situation, please know that you are not alone. There is help, there is hope, and there is light in the darkness. I truly believe that stories have the power to inspire change, to remind us of our strength, and to light the way towards healing. If today's episode spoke to you, I encourage you to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you want to be a part of the efforts I'm working on to strengthen domestic abuse laws and create resources for survivors, please reach out. I would love to hear from you. Until next time, remember, you're stronger than you think, you're not alone, and there is always hope. Take care, and I'll see you in the next episode of the Destiny Awaits podcast.